Hello, thank you for coming to my video. If you would like to help my channel grow, please like and subscribe, and please click on this little bell icon so you never miss a future video. Hello everyone, how's everyone doing today? So back when I first started collecting retro video games a few years ago, I was trying to find a good solution for connecting my retro video game consoles to my big screen TV that would fit my needs. I didn't want to fork over $300 or $400 for the Framemeister at the time. My Denon receiver, my home stereo receiver that I had recently picked up used, it had S-Video inputs, and it had the capability of taking S-Video composite component and upscaling that through the HDMI output. However, it didn't read any 240p signal from the S-Video port. So after a few months of searching, I eventually gave in and spent the extra money on the Framemeister, which I still use today, and I'm very happy with it. And then I was using the S-Video inputs with it, and then upgraded to RGB SCART cables, and then until recently I'm now using HD Retrovision Component cables. I recently came across the device called the RetroTINK2X, which is this guy right here, and I just got it. And it is a nice low budget solution for around $100. And after testing this device and playing around with it, I love this thing. If I would have came across this 2 years ago, if it had existed back then, this would have been perfect for my needs back then, and I'd probably still be using this and only be using this since then and probably never looked back. So in a nutshell, the RetroTINK2X, it's a device, it's very simple, it's easy to use, it's plug and play, it doesn't have any menus, it doesn't take a remote or anything like that, it's just got two buttons on it, you just plug it in and use it. That's it. It basically takes any 240p source and it line doubles it to a 480p output. It takes component, S-Video, and composite. It doesn't do RGB, no SCART connectors or anything like that. So if you want to use an RGB output, you would have to get an RGB to component transcoder though. So unlike the Framemeister or OSSC, it's much more simplified. No menus, no profiles, no option menus, none of that crap. You just plug it in and use it. It's great. It's so simple to use for anyone that just doesn't want to deal with any of that crap. So you got two buttons here. You got one labeled as smoothing on the website, but it actually switches from 3 different video settings. So there's a pass-through mode. It basically takes the signal going into it and it outputs HDMI that same signal. Like if it takes a 240p input, it's going to output 240p input regardless of whether a TV or anything can read it or not. So the second setting, of course, is the line doubling mode, where it takes the 240p signal and doubles it to 480p, or it takes a 480i signal and does a Bob B interlacing technique, so it converts that to 480p as well. Or there's the third setting, which takes all the line doubling, but it adds like a smoothing effect, kind of like an anti-aliasing effect for anyone that likes that. I'm not a fan of that, but a lot of people are. I used to be. I used to kind of like that kind of thing, but now I prefer the pixels. So the input button does exactly what it says. You hit the input button and it switches between either component, S-Video, or composite. You got kind of 3 lights here. You'll see it when it's plugged in, but the first light is to show that you have the component input selected, the second light for S-Video, and the third light for composite. So if you ever have a device plugged into this and you have the wrong input selected, it's going to show your image in black and white on the television. Something to do with the sync being connected to the same signal on each input. So because of that, I do not recommend keeping all your consoles plugged in and more than one console's turned on at the same time. So I don't know what'll happen, but probably just not a good idea. So despite the low price and simplicity of this thing, there are a couple issues you have to take into account. First off, it line doubles it to 480p, but it doesn't go anything past 480p. So no 720p, no 1080p. So if you're wanting a device that does anything past 480p, 720, 1080, whichever, you're probably going to want to look for a different device like the OSSC or the Framemeister. Second thing to consider, which we already touched on a little bit, is it doesn't take any kind of RGB. It only does component, S-Video, or composite. So if you want something that doesn't need any kind of converter or transcoder, again, you may want to look at the Framemeister or OSSC. Another quick issue, but it's not that big of a deal. The HDMI port on it is actually a mini HDMI port. It's not like a full HDMI port, so you gotta get like a HDMI mini to HDMI cable. You can buy one that comes with it. It's like another $10. It's not that big of a deal, which I did. Or you can probably buy them pretty much at any store, Amazon. Honestly, it helps keeps the device small, so not that big of a deal, really. But final issue I had, and I did some Google searching, and I cannot find anyone else with this issue. So I'm pretty sure it's just an issue I'm having with my stereo. But I still want to mention it just in case anyone else does have the issue. But my Denon home stereo receiver would not pick up any of the sound from the HDMI port. And doesn't happen with any other device I have, but other than this. So I messed around with my stereo settings, changed it to Pro Logic, digital, stereo, whatever sound settings I could find. I just messed with them, and I could not get any sound through my stereo. Any of my TVs, or even when I hooked up to my Elgato capture card, it picked up the sound perfectly fine. So I'm narrowing the problem down to my receiver. So if anyone else is having this issue, or even if they are having the issue and they found a fix, please leave a comment down below, because I'm curious to see what it is. But it's not that big of a deal, because I mean, up top is where you put the audio inputs, and if I was using this, I'd probably just plug it directly into my stereo anyway, regardless. So you can hook that up to an audio switcher, or like I use a component switcher, so I would most likely take the output of the audio of that and hook that directly in my receiver, so I'm still using the component switcher perfectly. Everything will work perfectly fine with my setup. Now let's get to the pros. So first thing about this device is the input lag on this thing is super low. It's less than a millisecond. So I picked up a new TV recently. I picked up a 2008 model P-Series Vizio. Those TVs have a specific HDMI port. I believe it's the HDMI 5 port, where it actually has, it's actually dedicated for low input lag. So when I hooked that up through this and I switched the signal back from that to my CRT, I literally could not tell the difference with input lag at all. Some people might be able to tell, but I cannot tell at all. If I use my Framemeister, I could tell just barely a little bit, or if I use a different input, I could barely tell a little bit, but it doesn't bother me at all. This I couldn't even tell, so I mean, that's an impressive little thing. So next thing we already kind of talked about is the price. The alternatives like the Framemeister, I mean, that's anywhere between $325 and $375 depending on where you buy it from. The OSSC is around $150 to $200 and doesn't even take S-Video. S-Video cables can be super cheap, so if you're buying this thing, which is around $100, S-Video cables, I mean, you can buy them on Amazon for anywhere between $5 to $10, and they're still pretty good quality and super cheap, and you factor all that in, I mean, you can have a really nice, inexpensive alternative that still looks good on your TV. Also takes composite input. Of course, it's poor quality, it's composite, but if you hook up composite through this, it's still going to look better than hooking it up directly to your TV because of the line doubling features. It's probably going to mainly come in handy for people that are using their NES, because the composite on the NES is the best signal you can get unless you mod it. Since the RetroTINK also takes S-Video, it's a great alternative to the OSSC because that device does not have an S-Video input, and they phased S-Video out on all modern televisions for the last few years. So the first thing I did when I hooked this up is I tested out the quality of S-Video through the RetroTINK2X with all my retro consoles that I currently own during the filming of this video, with the first being the Super Nintendo. And I was very happy with the results. Keep in mind, my Super Nintendo is a one-chip Super Nintendo. Not a lot of people knew this at the time, but the Super Nintendo actually supports native S-Video output, with the exception of the Junior model. So as you can see here, it looks really good, and it's a great alternative to low quality composite, and it's still very affordable. So next I hooked up the Nintendo 64 to the RetroTINK, and I found the quality to look great. For those who don't know, the S-Video is the best video source you can get out of the Nintendo 64 if it's not modded. So since there are consoles out there like the Nintendo 64 where S-Video is your best option for video quality if you don't want to mod your console, the RetroTINK is a good option over the OSSC for that reason.
I then hooked up the Sega Saturn through S-Video cables. Again, I got these S-Video cables really cheap off Amazon. I've had them for years, and I was really pleased with the result for the price that I paid for them. If you simply just want your games to look good on a monitor TV, it's a great option. I also tested the length of time when switching resolution. Playing Castlevania Symphony of the Night, like when you go from the menu, it switches from 240p to 480i and back to 240p, and of course it has the same delay problem that the Framemeister and the OSSC have.
The last video test, I kind of did something fun, different, and I tested my Sega Dreamcast with the RetroTINK. Now, the VGA output on the Dreamcast is your best option on that system, because the Dreamcast is one of the only two consoles that natively support VGA output. So most of the HDMI connectors that you find for the Dreamcast, it's from that VGA source. And that's the only way to get a true 480p output from the Dreamcast, is from the VGA signal. A lot of people, like myself, have had trouble video capturing with HDMI using the VGA source because of that reason. Just a lot of capture cards just don't want to read it or have trouble with it. I actually have to run it through my Framemeister to be able to capture 480p from HDMI. Using an S-Video source is a good alternative just to make everything simple. I mean, the quality is not going to be as good as the 480p. It's going to be a nice little compromise, and I'm pretty happy with the results. So the last round of testing I did with the RetroTINK2X, I decided to use my HD Retrovision Component cables for all the consoles that I have them for, which, for those who have watched earlier videos, I absolutely love these cables. They're just so simple to use. You can just plug them into your Framemeister or OSSC like normal, or just plug them directly into your CRT and not have to worry about any kind of transcoder device. So the first console I tested was my Super Nintendo. Again, it's a one-chip Super Nintendo, so the video quality of my Super Nintendo is going to be better than average. The quality on this looks really good. If your Super Nintendo is not a one-chip, you might not be able to tell the difference between going from S-Video to RGB or S-Video to Component. So S-Video is probably your best option just because of the price, and you're not going to see that much of a difference in the sharpness of the picture. The color quality you might, but the sharpness most likely not. So next, I tested out my Model 1 Sega Genesis, which the Genesis consoles have horrible composite video quality, but amazing RGB video quality. So because the Genesis doesn't support S-Video unless you modify it, which I haven't really looked much into, RGB or HD Retrovision cables are your best bet for any good quality on the Genesis. And the video quality of HD Retrovision cables into the RetroTINK look really good, and I'm really happy with the result on that. So then I tested the 32X console, which, just like the Genesis, does not support native S-Video. Quality through the RetroTINK looks really good, and like I explained in previous videos, My 32X has this strange issue with some video distortion. So if you notice it here, it's not caused by the RetroTink. It is in fact my 32X. Like I mentioned it in one of my Mortal Kombat videos, like my Mortal Kombat 2 video, I think it was. So probably just need to replace the capacitors. I don't know if it's a common problem or not, but I don't want to mention it here. It's definitely not the RetroTink. And for the last test with HD Retrovision component cables plugged into the RetroTINK2X, I hooked up my Sega Saturn, and the video quality looks really good, just like the previous tests. Even though the Saturn supports S-Video, unlike the Genesis or 32X, there's still a nice little noticeable increase in the video quality using HD Retrovision component cables versus S-Video into the RetroTink. So definitely happy with the results on that. So in addition to the previous test, I decided to do a couple more things for fun, which was to test the RetroTINK2X with an HDMI PC monitor that doesn't have like any kind of TV capabilities or anything like that. It was mainly designed as a PC monitor. Just basically want to test the compatibility and make sure it worked correctly on it. So I still keep this 22-inch 16:10 monitor with a max resolution of 1680 by 1050. I still keep it lying around, and the RetroTink on it looks really, really good. So, had no issues with compatibility on any kind of monitors. And just for some extra fun, I used my HDMI to VGA adapter, and I displayed my Super Nintendo games through the RetroTink into my old Dell CRT monitor, which I was super happy with the results. And I wish I had a scanline generator to hook up to this, just to kind of see how that would look, like kind of like a poor man's PVM, since I don't have a PVM yet. Also took a second video with the flash turned off just to show that the brightness of my monitor isn't dim like it kind of looks in the first video. So yeah, it looks really good. It's basically my poor man's PVM at the moment. So the $100 question: should you buy the RetroTink? If you aren't looking for a perfect video quality solution and you just want a simple solution to make your games look better instead of plugging a composite video source directly into the TV, if you want something that's just easy to use, you don't have to worry about menus or anything like that, yes, definitely. I mean, like I can't say this enough, I love how simple it is to use this thing. It's just plug and play. If you're not wanting to spend a lot of money and you just want something that's just passable, just something really cheap, again, it's not just the price of the RetroTink, but it's also the price of the cables that you would use with it, like the S-Video cables, instead of having to use RGB, SCART, or component cables, with the exception of the Genesis, of course. But yeah, I mean, this device is a great low-cost alternative. Again, if I would have bought this a couple years ago, if it had existed back then, I would be still using this and I would not have looked back. But since I'm already using a Framemeister, I'm kind of stuck and addicted to the video quality, so I'm still using that, but I will definitely keep this around for whatever projects or just for fun. However, if you're wanting the best quality available for your retro consoles and prefer support for SCART cables or anything like that, then the OSSC or Framemeister is probably a better option for you. Even if you do use those devices, this thing is still handy to have around, especially for around the $100 range. If you want to watch my old Framemeister or OSSC comparison video that I did back before they made the OSSC with HDMI support, I'll put a link to that in the description. You can even leave a comment on that video with my bad audio editing with a little too loud music in the background, kind of my first video I did. Also, if you want to see the video I did comparing HD Retrovision cables to SCART cables, I did a kind of a quality comparison video with that. I'll also post that in the video description. Thank you everyone for watching. Let me know what you think of this thing. If you have it, if you're interested in buying it, I'm curious to see what other people say about it. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.